Welcome to the ultimate Storyblok and Next.js tutorial. In this video tutorial, you will learn how to integrate Storyblok headless content management system with Next.js. We will also do our styling with TailwindCSS. If you have no experience with either of them, don't worry, we will go over step by step. We will start off with Storyblok and learn how to model our content with different types of blocks and fields. We will learn the best practices of Storyblok and some of the amazing features such as the live preview mode. The live preview mode allows people to visually edit the content on the website without touching any code. You can edit the content in real time, and once you are finished, you can publish the changes and your website will get automatically built by Vercel. We will learn how to use the Storyblok SDK to fetch the content and display it in Next.js. You will also learn a lot of cool programming tips. This video is divided into chapters and we will begin with content modeling in Storyblok. We're gonna get started with Storyblok. So click on the link in the pinned comment to create your account. Storyblok provides a generous free tier, so you don't have to pay a single cent to finish this tutorial. In the homepage, click on Login and create your account. After that's done, it takes us to the Spaces section, where we can click on Add Space. Let's give our space a descriptive name and click on Create Space. Great, now we can just click on Continue with Trial, and after our free trial has ended, it will switch us to the free tier. Let's take a look at the user interface on where the most important parts are. We're gonna spend most of our time in the content section. Here we will create all of our pages, or as Storyblok calls them, stories. For now, we can delete the default homepage. In the blog library section, we can find all of the blogs that are created in our projects. Blogs can be things such as pages, or components that can be inside pages, such as hero sections. Looking at all the pages in our website, a good place to get started with is the tour page. On the tour page, we have many interesting elements such as the headline, the hero image, the description, and the rich text content. So let's click on New Blog and give it a name Tour. And then we have to make a decision. What is going to be our blog type? A nestable blog, a content type blog, or a universal blog? For pages, we're gonna choose content type blog. Next, we have to create all of the fields to our blog. We're gonna add a name field, which is of the type text. Next, we're gonna add an introduction field, which is also going to be text. Then we're gonna add a price and change the field type to a number. Then we're gonna create main image, which is gonna be of the type asset. And of course, we need to have the location field, which is gonna be of the type single option. And at last, we're gonna have the field body, where we're gonna write most of the content on this page. And it's gonna be of the type rich text. Now that we have added all of our fields, let's edit them and add some validations to them. For the name field, we're gonna make it required and click on Save and Back to Fields. We're gonna do the same thing for introduction, making it required. For the price field, we're gonna make it required, and after we scroll down to the bottom, we can set the minimum value to 0, as we don't want to give any negative numbers as the price. For the main image, we're going to make it required and set the file type to images. For the location, we're going to make it required, and this single option is basically a drop-down menu. So let's set all of the possible options. We're going to change the source to self, and then let's give all the possible options that we want users to choose from. We're going to add Taipei, Jiufen, and at last, Kaohsiung. Let's save it and go back to fields. For the body, we're gonna make the most changes. At first, we're gonna set it to required. And scrolling down, we wanna check Customize toolbar items. The rich text field allows us to add different types of elements, but we might not want to have all of them. So let's just select bold, unordered list, H2 and H3, image and italic. And let's save it. Now that we have created our first block for the tour pages, let's actually create one by going into the content section. To organize our tours better, we're gonna first create a folder to host all of them. So click on Create New and choose Folder. We're gonna give it the name Tours. And Storyblok will automatically create the slug for us. And we're gonna set the default content type to Tour. And click on Create. Let's head inside the Tours section and click on Create New. And this time we're gonna choose Story. Let's give our first story a descriptive name such as Taipei Walking Tour and click on Create. This brings us to the content editor. In the center of the screen, we can see the visual editor. We will enable this later in the tutorial so content editors can make changes to the pages in real time. For now, we will just focus on the form view to create some content for a Next.js application. Let's give our tour a name and a simple introduction. Let's edit a price. And let's choose a nice image. We're gonna upload one from our computer. And let's choose a nice image. After we have selected it, we can hover over the name that will show us some advanced options. Let's click on it, which will allow us to set the alt text. After we have done that, click on Save and Upload. You can find free images like this from websites such as Pexels. Let's select the image, and then we need to choose the location. And we can see that we can only choose from the options that we created earlier. And at last, let's create some body text to give a good overview of our tour and what the visitors can expect. For the what to bring header, we can make it an H3. And the introduction to Taipei, let's make it H2. Next, we can highlight some of the sentences and make them bold. And we can add a nice image to make the content a little bit more interesting. So let's click on Picture and upload a new image. And just like before, we can click on Advanced Options to give our image an alt text. Let's click on Save upload. And once it's done, let's select the image. Great, our first tour page is done. Let's hit on publish to save it and publish the page. To preview what we're gonna get when we fetch this story, click on the down arrow and choose Published JSON. This will open a new tab with all the content that we get when using the Storyblok SDK. We can see that under the content, we have the UID and the fields that we set, such as the body, the name, price, and location. One of the most important things is the component, which is set to tour. In React, we will use this component value to render a React component for each content type. Now that I've created the story, I'm gonna go ahead and create 2 other stories, just like this one, so we have a little bit more content to play around with. Now that I have created 3 tours, we can move over to VS Code to start building our Next.js application. To initialize our Next.js application, we're gonna use create next app. So in your command line, run the command npx create next app at latest. Create next app will ask us several different questions about our project. We're gonna choose yes to proceed. And we're gonna give our project a name. And choose yes for TypeScript, for ESLint, TailwindCSS, source directory, app router, and no to customize the default import alias. Then create next app will install all of the dependencies. And after a short while, our project is ready for development. To start the development server, run the command npm run dev, which will start the server at localhost 3000. If we open up this page in our web browser, we can see the default project. Let's take a look at what the Create Next app created for us. Most of the important stuff is inside the source directory. And here we have the app directory where all the pages of our applications are. The page.tsx is the main homepage of our application. There's a lot of markup by default, so we can delete it all for now and just return hello world. And if we open up the website at localhost 3000, we can now see the hello world text. So it updates in real time. Next, let's go to the globals.css, and we can see there's some CSS by default that we can now delete. And once we do that, we got rid of some of the default styles. Next, let's take a look at the layout.tsx. Layout is a special type of file that basically wraps the current root and all the child roots under it. This is a great place to set up some default styles and some markup like a header and a footer. Let's come here and add a little bit of text. Let's write layout. And once we save it and open up our browser, we can now see the layout text is there. And it will be there for every root that is under it. So let's create a new root now. Let's call it tours. And we need to create page.tsx. Pages in Next.js are just React components. So let's create a simple component that returns tours page and export it as the default. Let's save it, open up our browser and go to /tours. And yeah, we can see the tours page text there and also the layout. Now let's create our first dynamic route. and let's call it slug inside brackets. And then we're gonna create page.tsx. And once again, let's just create a simple component that returns tour page and export it as the default. Now we can go tours/123, for example, and it takes us to the tour page. In fact, we can change the path name to anything and it will work. This is how dynamic routes work. But how do we get the path? Well, that is given to us by the props that the component takes. So let's take the props and just JSON stringify the props to see what we get. Let's save it and open up our browser, and we can see that there's params with the slug of 4, 5, 6. Now if we change it to 1, 2, 3, we can see that that is the slug now. So this is the way how we can get the path and then fetch the correct resource for it, which in our case is gonna be the tour. Now let's get to the main part by installing the Storyblok SDK. So run the command npm install at storyblok/react. Once that is done, we can initialize Storyblok SDK in our Next.js application. So let's go to the layout.tsx and let's import the required functions: Storyblok init and API plugin from Storyblok React RSC. The RSC is important because we're dealing with React server components. Then we're gonna call the Storyblok init function with access token set to an empty string, and we're gonna use API plugin. To enter the correct access token, let's first create .env.local file. This is a way for us to set some environment variables. Let's create a variable Storyblok token, and then in our Storyblok, let's go to settings, access tokens, and we have one token already created for us. Let's click on edit and make sure that the access level is set to preview. Let's copy the token and paste it to our .env file. When we deploy this to Vercel, we will set the access token through an environment variable using the Vercel dashboard. And here we set the access token to process.env.storyblok token. Now let's go to our tour page. First, let's import the required functions, get Storyblok API from Storyblok React RSC. And we're gonna use this function to fetch our stories from Storyblok. So let's create an asynchronous function fetch tour page that takes a single parameter slug. Inside the function, we're gonna first initialize the client by calling the getStoryblok API function. Then we will use the client to call the getStory function that takes two parameters. One is the full slug for the story, and the second is optional parameters. Now let's hop over to Storyblok and find an example of a story. We'll go to content, then tours, and let's select the Kaohsiung Night Market tour. And here we can see the slug for the story. Once we open it, on the top left corner, we can see the full slug, tours/Kaohsiung Night Market tour. So in the get story, let's add the function tours/ and then the slug that we will get. And for the options, we're gonna set the version to draft. And at the end, we're gonna return response data story. Now we can edit the tour page component and make it asynchronous. And inside of it, we're gonna call the fetch tour page function with the props params slug. And the return is a story. So let's print it out and see what we get. we get a 404 error. We cannot find it, and this is because we are trying to fetch a tour with the slug 123. So let's change it to Kaohsiung Night Market Tour and see what we get. And we have all the same data that we got when we previewed the published JSON. Now that we have all the data, let's jump into VS Code and see how we can use Storyblok to render components. When using Storyblok to render components, each block, either a content type block or a nestable block, will correspond with a React component. And this will also allow us to enable the visual editing in Storyblok. Let's create a new folder, components, to better organize our files. And then we're gonna create Storyblok provider.tsx. And we're gonna use this component to render components based on the Storyblok stories. So let's import props with children from React and Storyblok init from Storyblok React RSC. Let's initialize Storyblok and set the components to an empty object and enable fallback component. Unlike what we did in the layout.tsx file, here when we initialize Storyblok, we are not gonna give it the access token or the API plugin, as we're gonna use this to only render the components, not fetch data, as this is a client component. And next we're gonna export the Storyblok provider, and we're just gonna return the children, and we're just gonna use it just to get the Storyblok initialized. In our layout.tsx, we are going to wrap our whole application into the Storyblok provider. Then we're gonna go to our tour page and also import Storyblok story. And instead of returning the div, we're gonna return the Storyblok story that takes a parameter story that is gonna be the tour page we just fetched. And if we go back to the browser, we can see component could not be found for block tour. Is it configured correctly? And this error message is good. It means that we initialize Storyblok on the client side as well. So let's create the component for the tour. Let's create tour.tsx in our component folder. And we're gonna export a tour component that just renders the props it gets inside pre-tags. Then we're gonna go to our Storyblok provider and import our tour component. And in our components object, we're gonna set the key tour to the value of the tour component. Now when we save it and jump back into browser, we can see something different. Storyblok realized that this component is of type tour, so it rendered our tour React component, which shows all the props that it got. And we can see this data is the text that we wrote in our tour in Storyblok. Now let's render something more interesting than just the props. Inside our tour component, let's remove the pre-tags and instead return h1s with the text set to props block name. Let's save it, and in the browser we can now see the name of our tour. And if we change the slug to type a walking tour, we can see that it also works correctly. For now, we're just gonna add some simple text just to make sure that all of the blocks are working correctly. Later on in the tutorial, we're gonna add more markup and styling with TailwindCSS. Now let's jump back into Storyblok and use the same steps to create a block for our home page. So let's go to our block library and let's create a new block, and we're gonna call it page, and we're gonna set it to a content type block. And let's click on add block. Now let's create some fields for our page. Let's create a field blocks and set the type to blocks. And let's click on add. How blocks works is instead of rendering text or numbers or images, we can nest other blocks inside of it. and order them, and this way we can customize our pages very easily. Let's save it for now and start creating the blocks that we can nest inside of it. To better organize, let's create a new group called nestable blocks. Let's go inside the group and create a new block. We're gonna call it hero and set the type to nestable block. And let's click on add block. Now for our hero section, we're gonna need a headline field, which is gonna be text. And then a content field. And let's click on the hero headline and make it required. And for the content, we're also gonna make it required. Let's go to config and scroll down to the bottom and set the block icon to green. Next, let's create a grid block that we're gonna use to show the testimonials and the features of our application. So once again, click on the new block and let's give it a name grid and make sure it's a nestable block and click on add block. Then we're gonna add the fields. At first headline and then items, which is going to be of the type blocks. So we can nest blocks inside of blocks and then nest more blocks inside of them. Kind of like recursion. And let's go to the config and set the icon to green again, so we can easily tell which blocks are nestable and which are not. Let's save it and create another block. Let's call it feature and make sure it's nestable. For the feature, we're gonna add headline and content. For the headline, we're gonna make it required. And for the content as well. And in the config, we're gonna set the color once again to green. And we can add these features inside of the grid section. And let's create another block, testimonial. And make sure it's nestable and click on add block. We're gonna add a name field and a comment. And let's make sure that both of them are required. So let's go to config and make sure that the block icon is green. Let's save it. And now we can go to our grid block and let's edit the items field. We're gonna make it required, and at the bottom we're gonna scroll and set the allowed minimum to 2 and the maximum to 3. Then we're gonna tick the allow only specific components to be inserted. And let's choose the 2 feature and testimonial components. Let's save it. Let's create a new block, recommended tours, and once again make sure that it's a nestable block. And let's click on add block and start adding the fields. We're gonna first add a headline and then a tours field, which is gonna be of the type multi-options. Let's click on add and edit the headline field. We're gonna make it required. And for the tours component, the tours field, we're gonna make it required and set the source to stories. And we're gonna restrict the content type to tour. This way we can only put tours inside of this component. And we're gonna set the minimum and maximum to 2. Let's save it. And let's go to all blocks. Oh wait, I forgot to change the color. Let's just change it now. So in the config, we're gonna scroll down and set the block icon to green. And let's go to the all blocks section. And let's go to the page block. And inside the blocks field, we're gonna scroll down and tick the allow only specific components to be inserted. And let's change it to groups and select the nestable blocks group. This way, only blocks inside the nestable blocks group can be added to our pages. Let's save it and let's go create our first page. So let's head over to the content section and click on create new story. We're just gonna call it home. And make sure that the content type is page. Once we have created it, we can add some blocks to it. Let's at first add the hero block. Let's go inside of it and give it a quick headline. And some content. Let's go back to the page and add another block. We're gonna make a grid section. Inside the grid, we're gonna give it the headline, Explore Taiwan's Unique Attractions. And we're gonna add some blocks here. Let's add features. Let's give the feature a headline and some content. Let's go back to the grid and add 2 other features. Alright, now that we have added the 3 features, let's go back to the page and add another block. We're gonna add the recommended tours block. Let's go inside of it and give it the headline. Now for the tours field, let's select it and we can choose 2 tours to add. Let's add the Chifen Photography tour and Kaohsiung Night Market tour and click on add. Let's go back to the page and add our last block. And we're gonna make it grid. Let's go inside the grid and give it a headline. Now instead of adding the features, let's add testimonials instead. Let's add a testimonial and give it a name and comment. And let's give it another testimonial. For this grid, we're only gonna add 2 items. This way we can demonstrate how we can dynamically change the styling based on the content. Okay, now that we have all the blocks in our page, let's click on publish. Now let's jump into VS Code and see how we can render these blocks in our homepage. Let's import getStoryblock API and Storyblok Story from Storyblok React RSC. And then in our tour page, let's just copy the fetch tour page function and paste it here. This way we can save some time. So let's call it fetch homepage instead. And we're gonna fetch the story with the slug home. And we don't even need the slug parameter. And in our homepage, we're gonna make it asynchronous. And inside of it, we're gonna use the fetch homepage function to fetch our homepage story. And let's go back to tour page and let's copy and paste this part of the code too. So we're gonna return Storyblok Story. Let's save it and see it on the browser. And we can see that component could not be found for block page. Is it configured correctly? And it is not. So let's first create the page component and then register it. So let's create the file page.tsx, and we're gonna return a simple component, just main tags. And in our Storyblok provider, in our Storyblok init function on the component section, let's first import the page and then add it there. So for the key page, you're gonna have the value of the page component. Let's save it, and now in our browser, we can see that the empty main tags are being rendered. Let's edit the page component. And we can just console log the params that we get. And we will need to use our console for running the server, as it's a server rendered component. And this is what we get. We have the component, which is page, and then we have the only field, blocks, which is an array of objects. And each of these objects is one of the nestable blocks that we added. So we need a way to loop over the blocks and render a component for each block. So in our page component, let's first import Storyblok component from Storyblok React RSC. And then we will map over the params blocks and render a Storyblok component for each of them. And we're gonna set the key to the UID value of the block. Let's save it, and now in our browser we see something interesting. We see 4 messages that a component could not be found. And these are the exact same blocks that we added in our tour page in Storyblok. So let's create all of those components. First, the hero section, which just returns a section with the headline and content. In our Storyblok provider, let's import it at the top of the page. And then we're gonna register it. Let's save it, and in our browser, we can now see the hero section. Now let's move on to doing the exact same thing for the grid section. So in our components folder, let's create a grid.tsx. And let's create a simple grid component. We're gonna import Storyblok component from Storyblok React RSC. Then we're gonna export a grid, which is a section, and inside of it we have the headline inside of the h2 tags. And then we're gonna map over the items and render a Storyblok component for each of them. Now in our Storyblok provider, let's import the grid and register it into our components. Let's save it, and now we can see it correctly. And as we can see, it tries to map over the features and the testimonials, but we don't yet have a component for them. So let's create it. Let's start by creating the feature.tsx. And this is going to be a very simple component. Just a div and the headline inside h3 tags and the content inside p tags. Let's import it and register it. And yeah, we can see it's working correctly. Now let's do the same process for the testimonial. So we're gonna create a testimonial.tsx. And we're gonna return the comment and the name. And in our Storyblok provider, once again, we're gonna import it and register it into our components. Let's save it, and in our browser we can now see our testimonials. Great, the last thing we need to do is the recommended tours component. So let's work on that one. We're gonna create the recommended tours.tsx. but this component is going to be a little bit different. Let's first just return the headline to see that it's working correctly. So in our Storyblok provider, let's import the recommended tours component and register it in the components. Now that we have registered it, we can see that the headline shows correctly. So now let's figure out how we can actually show the recommended tours that we added to the component. Let's jump into Storyblok and take a closer look at the block that we created. So let's head over to the home page and the recommended tours block. And we can see that we use the multi-select field for it. And we have selected 2 of the tours. Now let's see what kind of data we actually get from the SDK. So we're just gonna console log the parameters. And let's open up the console. Let's refresh the page. And here we can see. And we can see that the tours, it just gives us the UID for the tour, not the actual tour data. So how can we get the actual tour data? Well, we need to make some changes in how we fetch data. So let's go to our page.tsx. And in the get story, we're gonna add some additional parameters. Resolve relations, recommended tours, .tours. This way, Storyblok will resolve the relations of the recommended tours block on the field tours. Now with this change done, we can console log the parameters and see what we get. So let's refresh the page. And now when we come here, instead of returning the UID, it returns the object for the tours. So it managed to resolve the relation based on the UID. So let's create a component, recommended tour.tsx, that we can use to show the data. And it's a simple component that returns the story content name. Now we already have created a component for the tour, but we don't want to use that one, as that's for the tour page. This is just gonna be a simple card that is basically a link to the page. Let's first see what data we get from the props. And this is the data that we get from the SDK. And you can pay attention to the full slug. And this is for the Kaohsiung Night Market Tour. So let's import link from next link. Now let's turn our h3 tag into a link. So let's put the h3 inside the link tags, and then we need to add the href, which is going to be / props story full slug. Let's save it. And now when we hover over the text, we can see that it's a link and it takes us to the correct page. Let's try the other tour. And for the Kaohsiung Night Market Tour, it's also working correctly. Great job so far on the tutorial. Now that we have created the tour pages and the home page, let's now create the tour list page that lists all of the tours that we have on the website. So let's head over to Storyblok and go to the content section. Let's go inside the tours folder and create a new story. Let's just call it tours and check the define as root for the folder checkbox. And then we're gonna change the content type to a page. And let's hit on create. As we have already created all of the blocks, we don't need to make any new blocks. We can just add the hero section that we have already created. So let's add that one and give it a quick headline and some content. Great. Let's hit on publish. In our browser, we can go to /tours and we can see the tours page. Now let's jump into VS Code and fetch the new page that we just created. We can go to the home page and copy and paste the code to fetch the story. Let's go to the tours page and paste it here. And let's change the home page to tours page. And in the client get story, we're gonna change the slug to tours. And we can remove the resolve relations. Let's save it and jump into the browser, and we can see that it's working perfectly. And this is how easy it is to create new pages with Storyblok once we have defined our page types and the blocks that we can nest inside of them. Now next we're gonna think about how can we list all of the tours that we have in Storyblok. And we can just use the SDK to do that. So let's write the function fetch all tours. We're gonna get the client, and then we're gonna use client get stories. Set the content type to tour and the version to draft. And like the name implies, this function will get all of the stories with the content type of tour. And in our tours page, we can now use the function to get the tours. Now, instead of returning just the Storyblok story, we're gonna return also cards for the tours. So let's wrap the Storyblok story inside div tags, and under it, map over the tours and use the recommended tour component to render the card for each of the tours. And we need to import the recommended tour component, of course. Great job. Let's save it and see how it looks like in the browser. And look at that. It lists all the 3 tours that we have in Storyblok correctly. And the links are working as well. Now, before we move any forward with the tutorial, we need to talk about the caching issues in Next.js. And there are some few hidden problems. Let me show you. So this is the current home page of our application. And we can see that all the text is the same as it's in the home page in Storyblok. Now let me come here and change something in the hero section. Let's add 1, 2, 3 to the headline and hit publish. And let's open up our application and refresh the page. And we can see that the 1, 2, 3 appears there. So it's working correctly, right? If we go to some other page and then go back, we can see that the 1, 2, 3 stays there. But the problem is when we edit some code, for example, the layout, let's add X there and save it. And when we go back to the browser, we can see that the 1, 2, 3 disappeared. So the way caching works in Next.js is whenever it does a hot module replacement, meaning we change some code that it auto refreshes, it removes the caching. So we need to refresh the page again to see the 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this is a very annoying bug. So how do we fix this? Let's jump into VS Code and let's fix this issue. And it's due to the Next.js caching. And we need to disable the cache in the fetch function. So let's create our custom fetch function that we're gonna call cached fetch. And it returns a fetch with the input and the parameters, but we set the cache to no store. This means that we disable the caching. And then we're gonna use our custom cache function in our Storyblok init API options, and we're gonna set the fetch to cached fetch. This way, whenever the Storyblok SDK fetches data, it uses our custom fetch function that has the caching set to no store. So let's demonstrate how this works. Now, if we change this to ABC, the headline on the hero section, and let's go to our application and refresh, we can see that the ABC shows up there. And in our code, if we do some small change, let's change the X to Z, let's save it, and we can see that the ABC stays there. So this is how you can fix some of the caching issues with Next.js when using Storyblok. Now that our application is working correctly, let's add some more content and add some styling with TailwindCSS. Let's start with the heading section. So we're gonna first import link from next link. And instead of returning this layout, let's add a navigation bar. So we're gonna add a header, a nav tag, and two links, one to the home page and one to the tours page. And this is how it looks like. Let's add some styling with TailwindCSS to make it look more pretty. Let's start with the body. We're gonna add the inter as our font and set the background to a light blue. For the navigation, we're gonna make it a container, center it, add some padding to the sides, make it full width, add some padding to the top and bottom, make it a flexbox, and justify the content between each other. And this is how it looks like. A pretty basic navigation bar you see on almost every website. Next, let's move on to the hero section. For the hero section, we're gonna make it a container, center it, add some padding to the left and right, make it full width, add some padding to the top, and half of that to the bottom. And this is how it looks like in the browser. Now let's edit the text. For the H1, we're gonna center it, make it large, and on medium viewports even bigger, and make the font bold. And for the content after it, we're gonna also center it, make it large, and add some margin to the top. And this is how it looks like. Not too bad for less than a minute of CSS. Next, let's move on to the grid section. For the grid section, we wanna separate it from the rest of the content on the page. So we're gonna make the background a little bit darker blue and add some padding to the top and bottom. Next, we're gonna wrap all the child content into a container. Let's make it a container, center it, make it full width, and add some padding to the left and right. And for the H2, we're gonna make it 3XL and bigger on medium viewports and make it bold. Now for the items, we wanna wrap them inside a div. And as the component is a grid, we're gonna make the div a grid. And on medium viewports, we wanna have an auto flow of columns. And add some margin to the top and a gap between the items. This way on medium viewports, the columns are automatically one fraction sized. So we either have a 3-column or a 2-column layout. And on mobile layouts, there will be only a single column. Now let's style the features and testimonials. With the features, we're gonna make them look like a card. So we're gonna add some white background, padding, make it rounded, and add a shadow. Okay, that was pretty easy. Now let's work on the text next. For the H3, we're gonna make it bold and 3XL size. And for the content, we're gonna add some margin to the top and make it large. It's a simple design, but it gets the work done. Now for the testimonial, we're gonna do a similar card style. So white background, some padding, rounded corners, and a shadow. Now for the comment, we're gonna make it XL, make the leading more relaxed, and make it a slightly dark gray color. And for the name, we're gonna make it large, semi-bold, and add some margin to the top. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now let's move on to the recommended tours section. For the recommended tours, for the section tags, we're gonna add some padding to the top and bottom, make it a container, center it, make it full width, add some padding to the left and right. We pretty much do this to all the components on our website. And for the H2, we're gonna make it 3XL, bigger on medium viewports, and bold, and center it. Alright, now let's move on to designing the recommended tour cards. First, we wanna make them into a 2-column grid. So for the div tags, we're gonna make it a grid, and on medium viewports, we're gonna have 2 columns, and a gap, and some margin to the top. Alright, now let's design the actual tour cards. Let's head over to the recommended tour.tsx file. And for now, we're gonna delete everything that we have here. And let's add some new markup. We're gonna start by adding a div tags and an image for the main image of the tour. Let's save it and see how it looks like. Okay, we have the 2 images, but as we can see, they're slightly different size. So we need to resize them later. But first, let's add some more content. We're gonna add 2 div tags and an H3 with the tour's name. And next, let's add the price. And we're gonna format it using JavaScript. So inside p tags, we're gonna get the price, make it a number, and then convert it to the locale string with the EN US locale as a currency of Taiwan dollars with the minimum fraction digits set to 0. And this is how it will look like. This is a very easy way to format prices or different currency amounts. And then after the div, we're gonna add the location and a link to the tour. And this is how it looks like in the browser. And we can even test that the link works correctly. It goes to the children photography tour. And the other link, it also works correctly. Now let's do some styling. For the div, we're gonna make the background white, rounded corners, and add a shadow. For the images, we're gonna make them aspect ratio video, cover, and make it full width. And for the container after the image, we're gonna add some padding. Now it looks more like an actual card. And for the tags surrounding the name and the price, we're gonna make it a flex box, add a slight gap, and justify the content between each other and make the text large and bold. For the location, we're gonna make it dark gray, uppercase, bold, add some margin to the top, and make it small, and make the spacing between the letters wide. And at last, for the link, we're gonna make it bold, make it normal size, add some margin to the top, make it a block element, and add an underline. Alright, that looks pretty good. And this is how our homepage design looks like. With just a few lines of Tailwind CSS, we can make the content look pretty good actually. And on the tours page, we can see that the hero section is already designed, and also the tour cards are designed. So most of the work is already done. The only thing we need to do is make it into a grid. So let's head over to the tours page. And at first, we're gonna wrap the tours into a div that is a grid with 2 columns, a gap, container that is centered, with padding on left and right that is full width, and some padding to the top and bottom. And on medium viewports we have 2 columns, but on mobile layout we have only 1 column. Let's save it, and this is how it looks like. That was super easy. Using like Storyblok and these React components like this, it really helps us to create reusable components that we can use everywhere on the website. Now let's move on to designing the tour page. And we're just using the Storyblok story there. So we need to head over to tour.tsx. And currently we only have the H1 there. So let's add some more markup. First, we're gonna wrap it into main tags, add the tour's name, its main image, and an introduction. Let's save it and take a look. Okay, it still needs some work. For the main tags, we're gonna make it into a container, center it, padding to the left and right, full width, padding to the top, and half of that to the bottom. Okay, starts to look better. Now to the H1. We're gonna make it 3XL and bigger on medium viewports, and make it bold. For the image, we're gonna add some margin to the top. And for the introduction, we're gonna add some margin to the top, make it large, even bigger medium viewports, and make the leading relaxed. Now, how do we add the rest of the content that we wrote? At first, we're gonna import render rich text from Storyblok React RSC. And inside the div, we're gonna dangerously set the inner HTML to render rich text props block body. And as we can see, it rendered all the rich text correctly. It's not very beautifully styled though. I mean, we have all the elements, all the text, the headings, the lists, and the image. And to style it, we need to use a different method. Thankfully, TailwindCSS makes this super easy for us. First, we need to install TailwindCSS typography. And this package helps us style rich text like this content. Once it's installed, we will go to our tailwindconfig.ts. And in our plugins, we're gonna require the TailwindCSS typography. And in our tour.tsx, inside the div, we're gonna set the class to prose, and on medium viewports, prose large, margin to the top, and set the max width to none. And this is how it looks like. A lot better, right? The headings are correctly sized, text is larger and easier to read, even the lists are styled correctly. It looks pretty okay. Next, let's work on building our website and deploying it to Vercel. In our command line, we're gonna run the command npm run build, and this will build our website. Let's see what we get. After our website has built, this is what we see. And we can notice that many of the pages like the homepage, tours page and the tour list page are dynamic, meaning they're being server rendered. But we don't want this, as all the content is static. We want to statically render all pages. So let's work on to fix that. So let's go to layout.tsx. And in our cached fetch function, we are currently setting the cache to no store. And this causes all the pages to be dynamically rendered. We want to have no store only when we are in development mode. In production, we want to force cache. So whenever our node env is development, we want to use no store, otherwise we want to force cache. And this will fix some of the static rendering problems. So let's rebuild our website and see what we get. Okay, now it looks a lot better. The only route that is still dynamically rendered is the tours slug route. So let's work on that one next. Let's go to the page.tsx in the tours slug folder, and basically the problem is because the slug can be anything, how can Next.js know what pages it should statically render? We can use a function generate static params to tell Next.js that. This function will return a list of slugs that we want Next.js to generate for us. So first, let's get the Storyblok client and fetch all the stories where the content type is tour and the version is draft. And after that, we're gonna map over the stories and return just the slug. And yes, the function needs to be called exactly generate static params. This way Next.js will only generate the tours that are in our Storyblok. So let's run npm run build and see what we get. Alright, that's awesome. All the pages are now static. So it's ready to be deployed to Vercel. Now one more thing to do is currently we are fetching the draft version in all of the routes. In production, we want to fetch the published version. So let's change it. Whenever the node env is development, let's fetch the draft. Otherwise, we're gonna fetch the published. And let's add this to all of the places where we're using the Storyblok API. And also in our tours page, we are also gonna change the draft here as well. So version is gonna be draft in development and published in production. And lastly, in our homepage. Alright, that's great. Now we can build our website and see that everything works correctly. Let's check the Git status and commit all of our changes. Then we're gonna push our repository to GitHub and link it to our Vercel. So in GitHub, let's click on New Repository. And let's give it a simple name. And click on Create Repository. Then we're gonna copy the lines for push an existing repository from the command line and paste them in our command line. And let's run it. And then we hop back into GitHub and refresh the page. And we can see that our code is successfully published. Then we will go to vercel.com and let's log in with our GitHub account. And on the top right corner, we're gonna click on Add New. And we're gonna choose Project. And we're gonna import our Git repository that we just created. Now we need to set the environment variables. So let's open it. And back in VS Code, we're gonna go to .env.local and we're gonna add this environment variable to Vercel. So let's copy the name and the value. And click on Add. And then we're simply gonna just hit Deploy. And after a short while, our website has successfully built and we can now preview it on the internet. So let's click on the image and it will open our website in a new tab. And look at that. It was pretty easy actually. Like combining Storyblok Next.js and Vercel, it makes building this kind of content-driven website super easy. And of course, all the pages are working great and they look exactly the same as in development. Next thing we want to add is whenever we make changes in Storyblok, we want our website to rebuild automatically and deploy itself. So let's go to Settings, into Git, and we're gonna set a deploy hook. So let's create a hook. We're gonna call it Storyblok and set the branch to main and click on Create Hook. We will copy this value and then hop over to Storyblok. And in Storyblok, we will go to the settings and we will go to webhooks and let's create a new webhook. We're gonna call it Vercel and we're gonna paste the endpoint that we got from Vercel. And then we're gonna set what triggers we want to trigger this webhook. And we want to trigger whenever we publish or unpublish a story. So let's expand story and check story published and unpublished. And then let's click on Save. Now that our webhook is set up, let's test it out. So let's go to Content and into our home page. And let's go to our hero block. And let's change the headline a little bit. Let's change the culture to nature and hit on Publish. Now if we go to Vercel and to the Deployments tab, we can see that a new deployment just started and it got deployed via a deploy hook. So let's wait until our website is built and deployed and see if it worked correctly. Alright, that was fast. Took less than a minute. Now if we hop over to our code, our new website, and refresh the page, we can see that the headline has updated successfully. And this is how easy it is for content editors to make changes to the website without having any technological knowledge. Only thing they need to do is use Storyblok, edit the content there, and hit on Publish. Now that we have everything set up, let's start working on the most exciting part of Storyblok, and that is the live preview editing. When we view a story like this, on the bottom left corner, we have this button, and it will open up the live preview. So let's click on it. This is the visual editor, and currently it's just showing like a how would I call this? A tutorial kind of. So let's change the URL to our website. Let's go to settings and a visual editor. And then we're gonna go to our website that we deployed to Vercel. And we're gonna copy the URL and go to Storyblok and paste it to the location and hit on save. Now when we go to our content and homepage, we can see that we get an 404 error. This is because Storyblok is trying to go to the root home because our homepage is called home. But this is not the correct URL, so we can change that very easily. So let's open up the configuration and set the real path to a /. And click on save and close. Now we can see that it's previewing our real website. And this works for all routes. We can go to the tours page or the individual tour pages. Now let's go back to our home page. But there's a slight problem. If we try to edit any of the content on the page, like the headline for example, we will get an application error. This is because we haven't yet enabled the visual editing in our Next.js application. Thankfully, it won't be too hard, so let's start working on that next. The way we want to use the visual editing in Storyblok is we only want to enable it in conjunction with Next.js draft mode. So we're going to first create a route in Next.js that enables the draft mode, which then enables the visual editing. This way, on our published website, the users can't visually edit the content. So in our app router, we're going to create a folder API. And inside of that, we're going to create the folder draft. And inside of that, we're going to create the file root.ts. And here we're going to define our API route that will enable Next.js draft mode. So we're going to import draft mode from Next headers, redirect from Next navigation, and Next request from Next server. And then we're going to create a function called get that takes a Next request. We're going to get the search parameters from the request URL, get the slug from the request parameters, enable draft mode, and redirect to the slug and append all of the other search parameters to the end. So basically, if you want to use this route, you have to add a slug search parameter to any route that you want to redirect to and enable the draft mode. So let's set the slug to tours. And we can see that it works correctly. Now in our home page, we will import draft mode from Next headers. And inside of our fetch homepage function, we're gonna check if draft mode is enabled. And if draft mode is enabled, we wanna also fetch the draft version of our story. So whenever we are in development mode or the draft mode is enabled, we wanna get the draft version, otherwise the published version. And in our page.tsx, we wanna also import the Storyblok editable. And in the main tag, we wanna spread the return of the Storyblok editable given the params block. And this will add some special attributes to our main tag that will enable the visual editing. And we're gonna do the same thing to our hero section. So let's import Storyblok editable from Storyblok React RSC. And in our section tags, we're gonna call the Storyblok editable with the block. Let's save it, push it to GitHub, and wait for the website to build on Vercel. And once our website has built and deployed correctly, we can go back over to Storyblok. And in the settings section, in the visual editor, we're gonna edit the URL. So we're gonna add the API, draft, and slug equals. And basically, whenever we preview any content in Storyblok, it's gonna append the slug of the story at the end of this URL. So let's try it out. Let's go to our homepage. And looks like it's working. And if you can see, there's this faint green outline around the hero section. And if we click on it, it opens up the form on the right hand side. And we can come here and we can even click on the page, as that's editable too. So let's click on the hero section and edit the headline. So we can change the nature to culture. And we still see that there's an application error. So there's something more that we need to fix. And this error is due to the Storyblok not resolving the relations correctly when we are inside the visual editing. So in our page.tsx, in our client get story, we have the resolve relations set to recommended tours. But we also need to add this when we are in the visual editing mode. So in our Storyblok story, we're gonna set the bridge options to resolve relations, recommended tours. And this will solve the problem. Let's save it, commit the changes, push it to GitHub, and wait for Vercel to build and deploy the website. And once our website has built and deployed, we can go back over to Storyblok and test out the new feature. So let's go to the home page, wait for it to enable the draft mode, click on the hero section, and let's edit the headline. And look at that, it's working perfectly. And as you can see, it's working in real time. So this will make the job of content editors a lot easier. Now let's hit on save. Now it's important to understand that when we hit on save, we are not actually publishing any of the changes. So Vercel will not start a new deployment, and our production website, it doesn't have the changes yet. All of the changes are only happening in Storyblok, and only when we hit on publish will it deploy the new website with the new changes. Next, let's work on making all of the sections of our website editable. And let's start with the feature.tsx. So once again, we're gonna import Storyblok editable from Storyblok React RC. And in the parent tags, we're gonna call the Storyblok editable function with the block. And we're gonna do the same in our grid.tsx. Import the required function and spread the return on the section tags. And let's do it on the testimonial. Import Storyblok editable and call it on the div tags. And also on the recommended tours component. We are not gonna make the recommended tour card editable, as it's not really it's just a normal React component. It's not a component that Storyblok uses to render content, but we are gonna add it to the tour component. So import Storyblok editable and call it on the main tags. And now we need to check if the draft mode is enabled on these routes. So we already added to the home page. Let's add it to the other pages. So in our tours page, we're gonna import draft mode from next headers. And inside our fetch tours page function, we're gonna get the is enabled from draft mode. And if the draft mode is enabled or we are in development mode, we will not fetch the draft content. Otherwise, we will fetch the published. And we will do the same operation for the fetch all tours function. And we're gonna do the same thing for the individual tour pages. So we're gonna import draft mode from next headers. And inside the fetch tour page, we're gonna check if draft mode is enabled. And if it is, we wanna enable or we wanna fetch the draft content. We are not gonna add this to the generate static params function as it won't work. So let's commit all of our changes, push it to GitHub, and wait for Vercel to build and deploy our website. After our website has been built and deployed successfully, we can go over to Storyblok and test that the visual editing mode works on all pages. So on the home page, we can click on any of the sections and even some of the nestable blocks, like the features in this example. And we can, for example, change the order of them. And it's all happening in real time. That's pretty cool, right? And we can change any of the headline very easily. And like for the recommended tours component, we can change some of the tours that we have here. So let's delete that one and add the Taipei walking tour instead. And we can also reorder them as we wish. In fact, we can reorder any of the blocks we have on this page. So for example, we can put the testimonials block first. Yeah, and all the sections seems to be working correctly. That's pretty cool, right? Now let's try some of the other pages. Oh, and of course, we need to save our changes. We don't need to publish them yet, we can just save them for now. And let's go to the tours page. In this place, we only have the hero section. And it works correctly too. Let's check a tour if it's working correctly. We can see the tour component. So let's go to back and let's go inside the tours folder. And let's click on create new story. And let's call it Taipei Foodie Tour. Make sure that content type is tour and click on create. And let's add all of the data here. We're gonna add a name, a short introduction, a price, and we're gonna add a main image. We're gonna choose a location, and then we're gonna add some body text. And let's hit on save. And here we can preview our new tour. And if we go to the tours page, we can see that our new tour is being listed there correctly. And even in our homepage, on the recommended tours section, we can add our new tour there. And let's hit on save. Next, we can hit on publish on all the new pages that we added. And if we go to Vercel and deployments, we can see that it queued up 3 different deployments. But for this one, we only need the latest one, so we can cancel the 2 deployments before that. And once our website has been built and deployed correctly, we can now preview the new changes that we added. And here we can see the new tour that we just added. Next, let's talk about how we can optimize images with Storyblok and Next.js. Now, one thing we need to pay attention to is how fast our website is performing. So let's try the tours page on the Google Page Speed Insights test. And it's gonna diagnose any performance issues. And we can see that our performance is pretty poor actually. Especially when looking at the properly sized images. We could save around 26 seconds if we properly size our images, and around 8 seconds if we use some different formats. Also, our images do not have the alt attributes. But other than those issues, our website is performing pretty well. And there's few ways how we can resize our images. In Storyblok, we can see the tour page, for example. And we have 2 different images. One is the main image, and the other one is the image in the body. So let's replace this image. We can choose the image and click on the 3 dots on the top right corner and click on Open Image Editor. And we can crop the shape here. Let's do 16 by 9. And we can reposition the image. And once we're happy with it, let's click on the arrow and choose Save as New. Let's click on Advanced Options and add an alt tag. An alt text. And let's hit on Save and Upload. Let's select the image. And this is the most straightforward way how we can edit images. Next, let's find out how we can optimize our images programmatically, because we can't manually crop every single image. Let's take a look at these 2 images on the home page. Currently, we are only showing a small image inside the card. And the component we are using it for is the recommended tour. And currently, we're just rendering an image tag with the source set to the image file name. Now, Storyblok uses an image service. Basically, by modifying the URL of the image, we can crop it, resize it, and compress it automatically. In the Storyblok image service documentation, we find the guide for resizing. We need to append /m and then / the width and height of the image to crop it. So let's add this to our images, but what size should they be? Let's open the image in new tab to see what we are working with. As we can see, the image is pretty huge. We need to make it a lot smaller. But what is the correct size for this one? Let's check it out. We will right-click the image and choose Inspect. And when we hover over the image tag, we can see the height and width of the image that is being rendered on the screen. This is the most optimal size for our image. So let's add it to our URL. We're gonna make it a template string. And at the end, like the guide says, we're gonna append m and then / the width and height of our image. Let's save it, and nothing really changes. But if we open the image in new tab, we can see it's perfectly sized for our website. Next, let's see how we can reduce the image size by changing the quality. We need to append filters quality and then a number at the end of the URL. So let's do that one. For our image, we're gonna add the filters quality. For these images, we're gonna set the quality to 70, which is a pretty good compromise for the size of the image and its quality. Once we save it, we can see that the images look pretty much identical. There is not that much difference, but the image size is a lot smaller. Next, we need to set the width and height attributes for the image. The width is obviously going to be 736 and the height 414. This is the number we crop the image for. And setting the width and height parameters, make sure that there is no layout shift. And then we can set the alt property. And we're gonna set the loading to lazy to automatically lazy load the images whenever they come close to the viewport. Okay, here's the new page, and let's put it to a new page speed insights test. And look at that, we got the perfect score for performance. Making these small changes for images has a huge impact on how fast our websites load. Now let's go to the individual tour page, and we can see that the hero image is pretty huge. We should definitely work on this one next. And what about the image on the content? It also looks pretty big. Okay, so let's work on these two images next. To optimize the hero image, we're gonna use a different technique by using the Next.js image tag. First, we need to create a custom loader for the Storyblok images. So let's create Storyblok image loader.js in our source folder. And we're gonna use this image loader for our Next.js images. So this function takes a source, width and quality and returns a new link. Basically, we're once again gonna append the M and set the width x0. This basically means that it keeps the aspect ratio but scales the width down. And then we're gonna set the quality to the quality or 75. The next step we need to do is register our custom image loader in our nextconfig.js. Inside the config, we're gonna add the key images and set the loader to custom and the loader file to our custom Storyblok image loader.js. Now, whenever we use the Next.js image tag, it's gonna use this custom image loader. Let's go to our tour.tsx and try it out. First, we're gonna import image from next image. And then we're gonna add the image tag here. We're gonna add the same class as the normal image tag, set the source and alt attribute. And let's delete the old image. Now let's save it and see the tour to how the new image looks like. And we get an error, because when we use the Next.js image tag, we have to use the width and height properties. And if we take a closer look at the URL, we can see that we can get the width and height from there, 6000 by 4000. So to add those properties, for the width, we're gonna split on the /, take the fifth element, split it on the x and take the first element. And we're gonna do the same for height, but take the second. And this is what we get. If we're gonna go to inspect, this is what we see. It renders a normal image tag, but with some extra information, especially the source set attribute. to take full advantage of the Next.js image tag, we also need to add the sizes property. If we take a look at the image, we can see how wide it is. So this is the perfect size for it in desktop layout. So we're gonna set the sizes to 1504 pixels. And once we save it and zoom out and refresh the page and right click the image and open image in new tab, we can see that it loaded a pretty good sized image. It's definitely cropped down than what it was originally. But the image is not perfectly 1504 pixels wide. To do that, we need to add some different configuration, notably the device sizes. This is a property that tells Next.js what image sizes it should create for responsive images using the Next.js image tag. And we can set this value in the Next.js config. So in images, we're gonna set the device sizes to the values that we can copy and paste from the documentation, and then we add the 1504. And once we save it and refresh our page, we can right click the image and open it in new tab. And we can see that it's perfectly sized. Another optimization that we can do is set the image loading strategy for this image. As it's a hero image, we want to set the priority to true, as this image will be visible on the first page load. There is no reason to lazy load it. In fact, if we prioritize it, it's gonna load faster. Now let's see how it scales on a mobile viewports. When it's big like this, the image stays the same size. But when it gets smaller and smaller, it resizes based on the viewport size. So the smaller viewport, the smaller image. And we can see that the breakpoint happens around here. So let's copy the breakpoint amount and use it in our sizes. So whenever the max width is that one, we want the image to be 100% of the viewport width. Otherwise, we want it to be 1504 pixels wide. Now, whenever we scale the image really small and open it in a small tab, we can see that it loaded the correctly sized image. And whenever the viewport is big, it's gonna load a bigger image. Makes sense, right? Now, what about this image in the content? Let's jump into VS Code and see how we are rendering this image. We are using the render rich text function from Storyblok, and we need to add some properties there to customize the image rendering. So let's import rich text schema and ISB node from Storyblok React RSC. And then we're gonna add some additional options to the render rich text function. We're gonna add an object with the key schema, and we're gonna override the nodes property, where we're gonna override the image property and set it to a function that returns a single tag, which is an array of the tag image, and the attributes is a source with the image width set to 1504 while preserving the aspect ratio, lowering the quality, setting the loading to lazy, and setting the width, height, and alt text properties. Now that's a lot of code. But it works pretty well once you understand it. Basically, we only want to override the image property from the rich text schema while keeping all of the other properties default. And now we can check that the image works correctly. Let's open it in the Noob tab. And yeah, it's perfectly sized. Let's commit the changes, push it to GitHub, and let Vercel build and deploy the website. Now that it's done, we can see our live website. And let's refresh it and go to the tours page and select a single tour from here. Let's take the Taipei walking tour. Let's copy the link, go to Page Speed Insights test and analyze it. And we can see that our performance is almost perfect. And I think 98, that's good enough for me. And this ends our tutorial. Thank you so much for getting to the end. I know it's over 3 hours, so good job. Give yourself a tap on the back, a like on the video, and if you build something cool, send me the GitHub link. I would love to take a look. And see you next time.